Hello and welcome to today's session. We begin discussing a new play by Tennessee Williams, The Glass Menagerie. So, The Glass Menagerie has always been classified as a memory play. Tennessee Williams, the dramatist, the playwright himself, he chose to refer to this as a memory play, and that's a term that he coined too. But now when we are looking back at this play, it has larger implications with memory becoming a very major tool in helping us to look at not just this play. We find that most of the plays that we had been engaging with so far, the American drama of the early 20th century, it's largely about the recollections. Memory plays a very important role in most of the plays that we had looked at so far from the beginning, whether it's the Emperor Jones or Death of a Salesman, All My Sons, and even in You Can't Take It With You, we find that memory comes in as a very tangible presence, dictating the terms of the play, dictating the ways in which the identities of the characters are formed and shaped. Yeah? So we find that Glass Menagerie it becomes a trendsetter in that sense with the dramatist and the others referring to it as a memory play, where the narrative is drawn extensively from the lead character's memory. So the unreliability of memory and the poetic license, which is part of that process, that becomes that is something that gets celebrated in a massive way throughout this play. So this was a play which was premiered in 1944 and first published in 1945, and it was a major success even before it came out in print. And Tennessee Williams apparently had reworked this play from one of his own short stories, which was The Portrait of a Girl in Glass, and there was also a screenplay titled The Gentleman's Collar. So we find that this transition seems to be working quite seamlessly, and that's very evident in the many techniques that he has used in The Glass Menagerie. The positioning of the narrator and the way in which memory becomes an important tool in configuring the characters, configuring the plot. Yeah, so we find that this his exposure to these different genres and the cinematic eye that he has, and the eye of fiction that he has, everything comes together in a very seamless fashion in this play, The Glass Menagerie. So it also went on to win the Drama Critics Circle Award in 1945, and it was adapted into Hollywood twice, in 1950 and 1987. And later, there is also a connection that we can trace closer to home. There is an Indian adaptation of the play, which was released in 2004. A movie adaptation. It was a Malayalam language film titled Akale, and it also, the lead female character also got the Best Supporting Actress Award, the National Film Award for the Best Supporting Actress. Yeah, so we find that this is a play in that sense which is very malleable. The characters are very malleable. The plot is very malleable. It can easily get translated into any setting, even though it is across time, across a space, because the psychological turmoil, the aspects of memory which configure these characters, they are quite relatable, almost in a universal way, in any different setting, as we could see. So if we could try and summarize this play before we dive into a close reading, this play draws much of its action from the memories of the central character, Tom Wingfield, who's also the narrator. So this seamless transition is also made possible by the effective way in which the play gets presented. He first appears on stage as a narrator, and very seamlessly he becomes a character in a play which he himself is narrating. So there are these monologues in between which are used as very convenient dramatic devices through which we get a sense of what is happening, not just on stage but also in the minds of these different characters. Of course, it's a very tainted kind of memory, a tainted kind of narrative that we get, because we are seeing everything, we are seeing every character, we are experiencing every situation through the lens of this character who is retelling the story. So Tom Wingfield, when the play opens, he's not a very successful person. He's a young man who's caught in the middle of many things, and they are very evidently going through a lot of financial struggles. He's stuck in a boring job, in a He works for a shoe company which he does not like at all, and he has obligations towards his family. He is very attached to his sister very visibly, and to his mother too, but it always comes out in frustrated articulations, and towards the end we find that he is actually unable to do any of these things, and he becomes just a replica of his father who had left the family 16 years back, we get to know from the play. So the play is his recollection of some instances of his interactions within the family. And now, we don't, it's a very, a lot of mixed emotions over here. He has affection, he has regret, and there's also a lot of helplessness surrounding this play. The sense of abandonment that the other characters experience, and how Tom Wingfield was led to it. It also makes it difficult for us to judge any of those characters. The expectations of the mother, though it is unrealistic at some times, and the unreal world which the sister Laura chooses to inhabit, and the helplessness and this constant tendency to escape from everything real, that's there in all the characters. And we find that Tom Wingfield actually gets out of that system, gets out of that family. We do not know whether he is successful the way he is placed now, but we know that he had to escape from his family, which was a very suffocating space for him. So this memory could also be seen, or this memory narration could also be seen as an act of atonement. And we do not entirely know the future directions that the protagonist's life or the other character's life would take, but nevertheless, it stops at an interesting point, revealing to us more than anything the sheer helplessness in which the characters are stuck. So this play is set in the 1930s. Again, the depression and the way it manifests in individual lives in the larger society, that takes a large share, in terms of defining the background. The search for unemployment, the longing for a past which we do not know whether it was real or not, the longing to bring back a past which was more glorious than the present, and this anxiety about the future, all that gets replicated here in the in the 1930s, the Great Depression. So we will now begin to take a closer look at the play. It's a Glass Menagerie by Tennessee Williams. So this is written in 1944, but it is set in St. Louis in the year 1937. So the play begins with this long narration. So more than stage descriptions, we have Tom Wingfield as a narrator and a character. He switches his positions as and when it is required, when the movements across scenes are getting facilitated. So we'll quickly read through this narration at the beginning, where we are introduced to characters. We are being made familiar with the setting, the physical setting as well as the emotional setting. The Wingfield apartment is in the rear of the building, one of those vast hive-like conglomerations of cellular living units that flower as warty growths in overcrowded urban centers of lower middle class population, and are symptomatic of the impulse of this largest and fundamentally enslaved section of American society to avoid fluidity and differentiation, and to exist and function as one interfused mass of automatism. This is in fact a commentary that Tennessee Williams is giving too. So this is another aspect of this memory play. The author also becomes a character over here. The author sometimes inhabits the persona of the narrator and chooses to give his commentary on not just the setting of the play, but on the larger setting of the society, how things are being arranged now, how things are being reimagined in this new economic order. And this new economic order becomes not so much of an appealing sight, particularly when they're going through this period of depression, and even post-depression, even after the 1930s. Soon after that, we know the Second World War happens, and it's never a happy period, particularly these first couple of decades, 1930s, 1940s and 1950s, when these plays are being written, when these plays are also brewing in these authors' minds. It is also the lived experience which gets translated into these pages, which is why the dark irony in these plays the very grave ambience in these background, it's quite tangible over here. It's very palpable, the emotions which the characters are going through, because at some level it is an extension of the emotions that these authors are going through as well. And notably, if you look at the other plays that we have discussed so far, the opening scene is always in a confined space. The opening scene is always within a room or in a backyard. There is a very palpable domesticity about the opening scenes, and also how the spaces where the play open, how they're also confined, how they're also surrounded by these huge consuming settings, which are part of the the urban growth, which are part of the new financial order. So a critique begins right there with the setting. A critique begins right there in the way in which these spaces are shaped, and how the characters who are living in these spaces, the characters who inhabit these spaces, are always already suffocated and frustrated, because the space, in some sense, it functions as an objective correlative, replicating the emotions that the characters are going through as well, the characters are facing as well. So the apartment faces an alley and is entered by a fire escape, a structure whose name is a touch of accidental poetic truth. For all of these huge buildings are always burning with the slow and implacable fires of human desperation. It is possible to say that this commentary at the beginning, this narratorial intervention at the beginning in Glass Menagerie, it could perhaps serve as a commentary to all the plays that we have taken a look at so far. It's largely about the lives which are caught within such huge buildings, and as he puts it, they're always burning with the slow and implacable fires of human desperation. So we want to I would like to focus a bit on this structure, the fire escape, which keeps coming back, which makes a recurrent which is a recurrent presence in this play. The fire escape is included in the set, that is the landing of it and steps descending from it. There is a scene a bit later on, right at the beginning. We find that Laura, she's about to trip and fall on those fire steps, on those fire escape steps. So the fire escape here is presented right at the beginning, even before anything else is introduced to you, anyone else is introduced to you. We find that the fire escape here is getting presented as a symbolic presence. It's almost like a symbolic character, because it is, and then the narrator, we have a narrator over here who always is, who always wants to give away his version of how he is looking at objects around him, how he's experiencing life around him. So as he himself puts it, there's a touch of accidental poetic truth, because all characters in this play, they're constantly looking of ways to escape. And the fire escape being at the center, a silent character in the peripheries, it accentuates this symbolic order. So the scene is memory and is therefore non-realistic. So this entire scene, whatever is happening in this play, it happens in the mind of the narrator, which is a very fascinating way to approach this play itself. We do not know. There are a lot of realist aspects within the play. Realism is there in a very, very core way in the techniques which are used throughout this play. But there is this larger irony that entire play is memory. It happens in the mind of this narrator, and we have absolutely no way of knowing whether it's actually happened or whether it's a figment of his imagination, but it's presented in a very, very realistic manner. So it borders on this memory and fiction, and there's a lot of self-reflexivity here, where the play is drawing attention to the nature of these descriptions. The scene is memory and therefore non-realistic. Memory takes a lot of poetic license. It omits some details, others are exaggerated according to the emotional value of the articles it touches. For memory is seated predominantly in the heart. The interior is therefore rather dim and poetic. And today, when we also have a lot of sophisticated tools to look at memory through the lenses of memory studies in particular, it's very interesting here to see that here memory is seen as something which is seated predominantly in the heart. It's very interesting that this heart get mentioned and not brain. Yeah, heart is seen, it's seen as a memory, is seen as a very emotional thing in a very, very appropriate way over here, and it is drawing attention to the genre, to the techniques, and saying that if at all there is any unreliability, if there are omissions, if there are exaggerations, yeah, if there are disproportionate attachments to particular objects or particular settings, then it is no one's fault. It is memory. It is a memory play, and this is how memory is entailed to function, because memory is seated predominantly in the heart. So the interior is therefore rather dim and poetic, because this is not happening in real time, in real space. It is out there in the memory space and in the memory time. Yeah, but at the same time, the curtain falling, the curtain racing, all those real techniques which are there around the stage, that also adds to this ironical bit about the realism and the memory sitting together. So at the rise of the curtain, the audience is faced with the dark, grim, rear wall of the Wingfield tenement. This building, which runs parallel to the footlights, is flanked on both sides by dark, narrow alleys which run into murky canyons of tangled clotheslines, garbage cans, and the sinister lattice work of the neighboring fire escapes. Yeah, there's a fire escape everywhere. And look at this description. It's very, very realist. It is a memory play. There is this allowance that it seeks for itself by saying that it is a memory play. There could be exaggerations, there could be omissions, but we find that in terms of its technique, in terms of the craft which is getting used over here, it stays very true to the realist tenets in terms of the descriptions, in terms of its earthy rootedness. So it is up and down these alleys that exterior entrances and exits are made during the play. Yeah? So look at this constant shift between what is out there for real and what is part of the play. Yeah? And everything is being made to deliberately converge towards how the play is getting staged. This constant attention to its form, yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah, it's perhaps much ahead of its times in terms of experimenting with this form of a presentation, where the narrator is drawing attention to its the form of the play, while also drawing attention to the fact that the narrator himself could be real or a part of memory, and there are no claims being made to any kind of truth, any kind of real presentation. We find that this is also perhaps an offshoot of the many experiments in theatre which is happening more predominantly in Europe and UK during this time. And we find that the American drama of the 20th century, it draws from, it absorbs all of these different experimental traditions, and it tries to infuse the 20th century American society. It tries to infuse a dramatic life into this the real background in which most of these plays are also set. So downstage is the living room, which also serves as a sleeping room for Laura. We're being introduced to different characters without necessarily spelling out the connections of those characters with the narrator. The sofa is unfolding to make her bed, upstage center and divided by a wide arch or a second proscenium with transparent faded portieres. Look at the specific details and the graphic way in which the descriptions are progressing. There's a dining room. In an old-fashioned, what not in the living room, are seen scores of transparent glass animals. So this is at the core of this play. It draws its title too from that, the glass menagerie, the glass animals which represent the fragile lives that the characters are leading at different points of time. And the fragility of these characters and the lifelessness are, and the unreal aspects of it, they all become very symbolic in this title and in this constant presence of these transparent glass animals. A blown up photograph of the father hangs on the wall of the living room. It's a larger than life image. He's never there, but he's a constant presence over there. He's also this presence which keeps dragging them towards unpleasant as well as unreal, but very idyllic memories simultaneously. Yeah? So a blown up photograph of the father hangs on the wall of the living room facing the audience to the left of the archway. It is the face of a very handsome young man in a doughboy's First World War cap. He is gallantly smiling, ineluctably smiling, as if to say, I will be smiling forever. It's in stark contrast to what the family is experiencing. There is an ironical tone about this play at every single step. Yeah, and here we could also notice that the narrator, while serving as a narrator, he's also giving stage directions. Yeah, there are multiple roles which are being served in this first session, which could be seen as a commentary, a monologue, a stage direction, a stream of consciousness narration, whichever way you choose to address it, and whichever way you enter, in whichever approach you have to enter this play, we find that all of those works quite well, and that is perhaps the greatest beauty of a play like The Glass Menagerie. The audience hears and sees the opening scene in the dining room through both the transparent fourth wall of the building and the transparent gauze portiere of the dining room arch. It is during this revealing scene that the fourth wall slowly ascends out of sight. Very detailed stage descriptions, just like the city has been described. This transparent interior wall is not brought down again until the very end of the play during Tom's final speech. There is a sense of anticipation here too, that whoever is beginning this, Tom has begun, Tom Wingfield has, is giving this narration, and he will also be there at the end. Yeah, and we do not know, we are not being made conscious of these transitions. The narrator is an undisguised convention of the play. He takes whatever license with the dramatic convention is convenient to his purpose. Tom enters dressed as a merchant tailor from alley, stage left, and strolls across the front of the stage to the fire escape. There he stops and lights a cigarette. He addresses the audience, and seamlessly the play begins now. So the memory play begins here with a tinge of irony by drawing attention to its own form, but staying true to some of the realist tenets, which are also very representative of early 20th century American drama. When Tom Wingfield begins to speak over here, we find that he's retaining that mode, that the ambience which has already been set. Yes, I have tricks in my pocket, I have things up my sleeve, but I am the opposite of a stage magician. Magician will also, it's a symbolic presence which will make a comeback soon, as we can see. He gives you illusion that has the appearance of truth. I give you truth in the pleasant disguise of illusion. So here this technique, the memory play technique, is being used to make the truth a bit more palatable, because it is unpleasant to the core. If we look at the other plays that we have discussed, Emperor Jones and Arthur Miller's two plays, All My Sons and Death of a Salesman, we find that there are unpleasant truths at the heart of it. And here, even when the play begins, we are being told that these different techniques, this illusion is being experimented with in order to make this disguise truth in a more pleasant manner. To begin with, I turn back time. I reverse to that quaint period, the 30s, when the huge middle class of America was matriculating in a school for the blind. Their eyes had failed them, or they had failed their eyes, and so they were having their fingers pressed forcibly down on the fiery Braille alphabet of a dissolving economy. So this is about the 1930s depression and how it affected the population financially, emotionally, as well as physically. In Spain, there was revolution. Here there was only shouting and confusion. In Spain, there was Guernica. Here there were disturbances of labor, sometimes pretty violent, and otherwise peaceful cities such as Chicago, Cleveland, St. Louis. This is the social background of the play. We are getting more and more aware of the background, the historical background. And here, as we have mentioned before during the discussion of the other plays, the way in which America responded to these crises was very different from the rest of Europe, or for that matter, it's very different even from the way England responded. So there were always sporadic disturbances, and the sporadic and continuous nature of these disturbances, it made it all the more difficult for them. There was no outbreak of a revolution in a visible way, like it happened here too, as the play also mentions, in Spain or any part of Europe. But we find that this sporadic and continuous disturbances, they were like this constant thorns in the American economy, in the financial stability, in the emotional journey of the citizens towards what they thought was this perfect dream, the perfect American dream. So the play is memory. Being a memory play, it is dimly lighted, it is sentimental, it is not realistic. In memory, everything seems to happen to music. That explains the fiddle in the wings. I am the narrator of the play and also a character in it. The other characters are my mother Amanda, my sister Laura, and a gentleman caller who appears in the final scene. So everything is very clearly spelled out. Yeah, right after the stage directions and the narratorial intervention, we already are introduced to all the major characters, and we were also told right at the outset that there will be a speech at the end by Tom Wingfield. So he is the most realistic character in the play, being an emissary from a world of reality that we were somehow set apart from. There are two worlds here inside this play. One is a memory world and one is a real world. Yeah? And the narrator is very conscious of this divide that he is making, the divide which was already there, either in reality or in his mind. But since I have a poet's weakness for symbols, I'm using this character also as a symbol. We find that this could also be, later we will see that he's an aspiring poet and he's stuck in a job, a very boring job that he does not want to be a part of. He thinks he lives with a very uninspiring family. So this could be Tom Wingfield escapism to a world where he can create his own reality. Yeah? So there are multiple possibilities that this memory play is opening up before us. And the transparency of this narrator, from whatever we get to see of him, is also further accentuating those possibilities. I am using this character also as a symbol. He's a long delayed but always expected something that we live for. And as we had discussed earlier too, the replications of Waiting for Godot may be found in more real and more grave terms in a number of instances in these plays, particularly the early 20th century plays. Yeah, so we find that the replications of Godot, Waiting for Godot, it could be found in various ways in these most of these plays. And finally he says there's a fifth character in the play who doesn't appear except in this larger than life-size photograph over the mantle, which we already noticed in the stage directions and the descriptions which were given at the beginning, where a commentary, a narratorial intervention and stage directions were all coming together. This is our father who left us a long time ago. He was a telephone man who fell in love with long distances. Yeah, so travel here, this fantasy for traveling long distances, that is seen as something very fantastic, but also something which will eventually cause a lot of grief to the people who are around these characters who are traveling. This is something, this fantasy about traveling to find fortune, traveling for pleasure, traveling to find their own life's purposes. It makes this is a theme which keeps coming back in various forms in different in many of these plays. He gave up his job with the telephone company and skipped the light fantastic out of town. The last we heard of him was a picture postcard from Mazatlan on the Pacific coast of Mexico, containing a message of 2 words, hello, goodbye, and no address. I think the rest of the play will explain itself. This is very comic, but there is a tragedy inherent in this. Yeah, the way the father's image keeps coming back, the way he is smiling, it's almost like mocking the situation in which the rest of the family is forced into. So we are now first introduced of the first character apart from the narrator, Tom Wingfield, whom we meet over here is Amanda. And Amanda is in fact a character who is living in the 1930s in the middle of all these depressing realities, and she seems to be from a genteel southern family. Yeah, so very shortly, we could also perhaps a bit later talk about the North-South divide and how that dynamics plays out during this financial crisis in America. Yeah, so Amanda and Laura, both of them are introduced over here, and we find that they are at the dining table. And we also notice that Amanda comes across as a very nagging presence, which is found very overbearing by Tom, and they don't seem to be having this pleasant relationship. Not even, it's not even bordering on anything cordial. It's outright unpleasant. We discover in every single exchange. Yeah, so Amanda is nagging his son to eat properly, and he responds with a lot of exasperation. I haven't enjoyed one bite of this dinner because of your constant directions on how to eat. So we find that Amanda is always picking on these little things. Yeah, it could also be because she's lost control of all the bigger things. Yeah, the father figure, he left about 16 years back, and we've no idea whether he's coming back or not, and she's been doing everything on her own. Her daughter is she has a defect, she has a disability, which also casts a lot of shadow on her prospects of finding a groom. And the son, Tom Wingfield, he hasn't yet got into anything successful, and he seems to be very ambitious in a very abstract sense, but he seems not to be working towards it. So Amanda is this character who is almost like a go-getter, but she's just stuck in these wrong timelines and these wrong circumstances. Yeah, she seemed, from whatever these recollections reveal to us, she seemed to have enjoyed a very she seemed to have enjoyed a fantastic life during her youth, getting a lot of attention. And she also looks like she had a more privileged background than what her children are now getting, and she obviously wants to give them the similar kinds of experiences, but it's just that she cannot find a means to work through that. So we find that she, because of that, she is always picking on these little things because she has completely lost control over all the bigger things, and she has absolutely no say on how Tom is going about his life either. And we find that even with Laura, who seems to be crippled, literally, metaphorically, that's a term that the play uses. Even Laura, who seems to be crippled, seems to be going away from Amanda's clutches of control when it comes to real matters. So Amanda's language also reflects that she's always living in another time and place. Her language always has a sense of unreality. She refuses to inhabit, she refuses to accept the reality that she encounters around her, but chooses to inhabit a different place and time where things were totally different. And even with her own children, she refuses to accept the reality in which they are all stuck in. So we find that in the middle of this, their breakfast, she suddenly starts with, I remember one Sunday afternoon in Blue Mountain, which is where she lived, and she was apparently courted by a number of suitors, with even 17 gentlemen callers coming in on a single day, as we would get to know very shortly. And when Tom says, I know what's coming, we know that this is a routine. It's a drill, it's a regular drill where she will narrate these glorious stories from her glorious past, and which has absolutely no resonance to the way in which they are living now. So Laura and Tom, they both know that she loves to tell the story, and she continues with it. One Sunday afternoon in Blue Mountain, your mother received 17 gentlemen callers. Why? Sometimes there weren't chairs enough to accommodate them all. We had to send the nigger over to bring in folding chairs from the parish house. Look at the vocabulary used over here. It's clearly evident that she was raised in one of those very well-to-do families in the South, and the terms that with the vocabulary which Amanda uses, it is also showcasing this wide gulf between these different Americas, the different settings and the struggles and the emotional expectations that people from these different settings have. So she gives a very detailed description of how things were with her during that time, and she's also giving these details of the callers, how there were these prominent young planters from Mississippi Delta, planters and sons of planters, and more details about who all came to see her, as a gentleman caller, and what they went on to become. So all of them were either very moneyed, very wealthy people, or they became wealthy later on. And this is Amanda's reality. This is a reality that Amanda chooses to inhabit, a reality from which on which she has no stakes, and from which she can she cannot draw anything. Yeah, so and this is the sadness, the pathos in this play as well. And what she ends up doing is that, you know, while this at some level comes across as very selfish, it seems that, you know, she's always talking about her own glorious past without even at the risk of being inconsiderate of what her children are going through. But as a play progresses, we realize that this inhabitation in the past, it comes from this anxiety about the future, or the lack of future thereof for her children. So Laura is this character, this quiet character who plays with these, you know, who preserves these glass figurines, the glass menagerie, the glass animal collection. And time and again, we find at the beginning in scene 1 that, you know, she's also asked to work on her typewriter chart, you know, to practice her shorthand. Yeah, and the typewriter, the presence of the typewriter over here is preparing the audience for the next scene. Something very unpleasant is about to happen, and we find that all the objects that are placed in this setting, they all serve a purpose. Yeah, they're not just there as props, they have a deeper emotional role to play as well. Again, you know, if you situate this in the context of the memory play, yeah, all the objects which are being remembered, all the places, all the sights, all the experiences which are being remembered and presented in this memory play are also those items, those experiences which have very direct relevance to the plot, to how the characters, how the plot, everything gets shaped and reshaped. Yeah, so we very soon, and Laura chooses to live in her own world, but she's conscious of the realities much more than how Amanda is. Yeah, so there is a reality that Laura here articulates, that, you know, I don't believe we are going to receive any, that you know, she knows that no one is going to come and call on her. There's not going to be any gentleman callers visiting. But Amanda chooses to close her mind to this reality, and this shift between reality and the ideal past that she chooses to inhabit, it becomes all the more ironic when we look at it from the perspective of a memory play. Yeah, so there are these multiple things coming together: memory, the reality, and also an idyllic past within the memory. Yeah, so there are different kinds of unrealities too that we encounter as we progress through this play. So Laura wants to call a spade and say, yeah, not one gentleman caller is going to call. Mother's afraid I'm going to be an old maid. And that is what the anxiety, the crux of the anxiety is. If Laura is not doing anything else in life, and if she's continuing to be you know, stuck in this place in her life where she is at the moment, Amanda is anxious, concerned, yeah, almost paranoid that she will just stay as an old maid, which seems to be the greatest catastrophe that could befall a young woman in the 1930s. Yeah, so with this hard stroke of reality, in fact, you know, reality mixed with fantasy, we come to the end of this scene 1. And if we could take a quick look at the text over here, we can find that, you know, there is no mention of the scene numbers. Yeah, it's just shown like, you know, the scene dimming out with the glass menagerie. Yeah, so this dimming out and then, you know, the scene coming back, that's also a technique used to foreground the aspects of memory play. So with this, we bring this session to a close, and we will continue looking at the play in the following sessions. I thank you for your time.